Here we are at the end of the last presentation of the entire conference. So it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Professor Georgia Mason from the University of Guelph. Professor Mason is a distinguished behavioural biologist and a leading authority in the field of animal behaviour and welfare. She's renowned for, amongst many things, groundbreaking research in animal welfare and adaptation to captivity. So Georgia did her undergraduate and PhD at Cambridge and then moved to Oxford in the Department of Zoology, where she worked for 10 years before sadly leaving us in the UK and moving to Canada in 2004 to take up the Canada Research Chair in animal welfare. Georgia's published over 200 papers, reviews, chapters, books, and so on, and holds a number of different international roles, including advising various different governments around the world on animal welfare. So today, Georgia's going to talk to us about 3 key pathways through which welfare research influences policy and practice. So without further ado, welcome, Georgia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks so much for inviting me. It's looked like a really fantastic meeting. I've missed the whole thing, so I'm going to be on YouTube a lot, catching up. So let me just get into presenter view mode so you can see my slides, but not my notes. So as Matt mentioned, I'm going to talk today about how animal welfare research gets translated into practice and how should it be in the future. And it's going to be a rather personal perspective based on what I realized with horror is 3 decades of experience. And these are definitely my personal views, not those of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare, which I direct. So I think I got invited because of this recent paper in which I argued that animal welfare science has enormous value, but that sometimes it can be more rigorous and that we should be more mindful of internal construct and external validity. Now, this journal restricted authors of these pieces to 10 cited papers. I presented mine as a journal club for research groups and grad students, which I hope some of you find useful, but my 10 were slightly contrived to hit all my points in 10 articles. So it's very nice to have a platform here as I can recommend more work for those interested, because there's lots of good writing on relevant topics. So I guess I was keen to say yes, partly because I've got increasingly jaded views about science in general, yet I'm even more horrified still by anti-science. And so I think we need to stand up and do work that's bulletproof. I have sorry, let's sort out my thing. I have some increasingly jaded views. It's just making me more and more angry and upset the older I get, because change is so slow. Yet I'm also a bit alarmed by some animal advocacy in which cases are made that are sometimes simplistic or even downright misleading, raising questions in my mind. Is it okay to present bad evidence for a good cause? You know, there's a bit of me that's sympathetic, but in the end, I think no. But I'm also heartened by a number of recent movements, including movements for open science, for self-critical meta-science, for grade in the world of medicine, growing recognition of the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and also the effective altruism movement. So that's inspired a lot of what I'm going to say today. On top, as Matt mentioned, I've got quite a lot of experience sitting on committees and working groups, making recommendations about animal welfare guidelines, laws, practice. I sat on 27, some of them for years, and they range from university level animal care committees to one European Union one. And like many in animal welfare science, I'm always on at least one committee. And it's been interesting to me, sort of anthropologically, seeing how these committees work. And then on top, I was keen to say yes, because my perspectives are shaped by long experience with a very controversial practice, in that for most of my career, I've worked with this fantastic little animal, the mink, and therefore mink farmers. And everyone loves to hate mink farming, but it's really not that bad. So that kind of dissonance has interested me. I thought I should also begin by telling you my ethical stance, because it may be different from some of you, and it's a constant work in progress because it's so difficult to be ethically consistent in all that you do or think. So first of all, not too controversially, to me, animal welfare is about how animals feel and suffering is bad, happiness is good. I probably don't need to justify that. To me, deviations from a natural life therefore don't matter unless they matter to the animal and cause suffering. And actually, death per se doesn't matter to me unless it matters to the animal and causes suffering. So I'm really concerned about quality of life. Perhaps more differently from some of you, I've realized I'm not a utilitarian, even though many in animal welfare science are, or at least feel that they are. And I've stopped believing that the harms we do to animals are excused by the benefits, which are often to humans. And my disillusionment with these kind of harm benefit analyses have really arisen because I'm not convinced that humans and other animals should be treated differently in terms of ethics. We don't treat humans like this, otherwise we would run experiments on prisoners for the greater good. We just consider that an absolute wrong and we don't do it. And I can't find a morally relevant difference between us and all other species that justifies this ethical distinction. Also, animals being used don't know why they're being used and likely don't care. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that, for example, a rabbit farmed for meat should be permitted to be treated worse than a rabbit being farmed for fur just because we regard meat eating as more necessary than wearing fur. Makes no sense to the rabbit. And finally, I've come to believe that our assessment of the benefits of animal use are just really subjective and value laden. So let me illustrate what I mean by this. So, as I mentioned, I've worked with mink for a long time. And I did this not because fur farming is bad, as some of you are probably assuming, but honestly because I'm a bit of a coward. And compared with other forms of intensive animal use, it's not that bad. Mink are left with their mothers till they're weaned off milk. They have space to move. These days, they generally have enrichments. They're not scared of people. And when they're killed with carbon monoxide, it's really humane. So from cage to death takes just a few minutes. Yet during all the decades I've worked with mink, the industry has attracted disproportionate hostility, and the reasons are often interesting. So I've had people, I think usually men, say to me, but mink farming, it's just fur for rich women, which is a strange and borderline sexist take. And more generally, I guess it's condemned for being frivolous and being of low benefit. But to me, many forms of animal use really are not necessary and also cause poor welfare in various ways and occur on a similar or sometimes even a larger scale, keeping pocket pets like hamsters, which we give to our children, racing horses, we don't need any of this, keeping wild animals as pets like parrots. There are as many parrots in captivity as there are mink on mink farms, yet they don't attract as much ire or as campaigning because they're seen as somehow more normal, and so many people we know indulge in these. And even something like research animal use, which seems really kind of worthy and which typically society regards as essential, is questionable. The chance that this rat will have poor welfare is very high. But the chance, too, that a group of rats will yield research that actually benefits human health is very low, well under 2%. So that might suggest that even this enterprise, biomedical research, is actually very low in benefits and perhaps even kind of frivolous. This poor performance of biomedical research is something I'll come back to later, as I think we can learn some useful lessons from it. My other sort of unease with talking about benefits and factoring them into a harm benefit analysis is that my sense is that we love to demonize forms of animal use that are rare or done by people other than us, which is problematic for obvious reasons. And so I often get this sense that my animal use is essential, but yours is freakish and of little value. And seal hunting is an example, I think. Done well, it's really pretty humane. It only affects 150,000 animals a year, which sounds like a lot, but it's trivial in the grand scheme of things. And it worries me that an industry that indigenous people are reliant on is sort of singled out by people very disconnected from an Inuit way of life. So this is a long way of explaining why I'm not a utilitarian and why some of my views might be at odds with some of yours. Okay, back to the plan. So my brief today was to talk about how animal welfare science, how our research can change policy, And I see that there are three main ways in which this can happen. And by policy, I broadly mean recommendations, guidelines, occasionally laws, but also practice more informally. So I think it can lead to media-inspired public pressure. It can feed directly to animal-using industries, perhaps because co-produced or funded by them, or it can feed into working groups or committees who then synthesize evidence and make recommendations. And all of these have pros and cons, which I'll be going over. And then, because all of these have cons, I want to talk about three ways in which perhaps these processes can be improved for the sake of animals, and three ways in which animal welfare research can, I hope, become more impactful for animals and also more equitable. And by equitable, I mean reflecting a more diverse array of views from science, reflecting the more proportionate to the degree of animal suffering involved in the enterprise being looked at, so more equitable for both humans and animals. So I think we can learn from the effective altruism movement by some practices in medicine, especially GRADE, and by conducting better science and research syntheses. All right, so the first of the ways in which our research can impact policy is through media-inspired public pressure, sometimes leveraged or amplified by animal protection and animal rights groups. And several of you have mentioned reaching out to the media, both social and conventional, and good for you. There's many pros to this approach. So here's a couple of examples from my own work, and I'll talk about the papers behind these next. So this was a paper of mine that came out in 2001. It's a lovely study that I'm proud of. We asked mink what they want. Jonathan Cooper built a really fantastic apparatus, and we found that for mink, well-designed baths that they can hang out on the edge of and slither into as if from a riverbank are highly, highly rewarding. This work caused a stir as it was in a really high impact journal, Nature, and it was coming out from the University of Oxford, so that all looks pretty fancy. But there's a couple of things that concerned me. So one is Nature added this subtitle, which is a complete surprise to me. I did not approve it. Mink may thrive in captivity, but they miss having water to romp around in. This subtitle may actually be wrong for most mink. We showed that water's a powerful reward for the 16 water experienced animals we tested, but we didn't show that they miss it if they've never had it. As an aside, Nature also missed off the credit for this lovely picture, and I just want to say a big thank you to Claudia Vinker from the University of Utrecht. So other studies since this work later showed that the lack of water seems not to cause deleterious consequences, at least for most mink that have never experienced it. At least not in Denmark, not in the Netherlands. It does in Finnish mink, however. And so this handful of studies and the fact that they're discordant raises questions about how the bath design affects the value of a watery resource, and also about how mink genetics might affect what they need and what they miss. So when this work helped cause policy change, for example, Germany decreed in 2017 that farmed mink must be able to swim, I wonder, was that the right thing to do? I think it was right if our principle is to give animals what they find highly rewarding, then that's great, but then we should apply that principle evenly to all animals on all farms, in labs, zoos, and people's homes. All mice should have running wheels, all dogs should have company, they should never be left at home. But should we single out this one farming practice? I'm not really sure. A second paper that got impactful media attention was this. This analyzed data from 4,500 elephants, and I'm much more comfortable with the impact this work had. So we had data representing half the global zoo population of female elephants, nearly 800, and we compared them with around 1,000 African elephants in Amboseli and around 3,000 Asian elephants in the Burmese logging industry. And we found evidence of premature deaths and short lifespans in zoos. And these deaths were predicted by being transferred between zoos, by being separated from the mother early, and surprisingly, by being gestated and born in a zoo, perhaps a reflection of heavy birth weights and the fat babies we tend to see in zoos. So this generated media attention on every continent. as a side note, even though the zoo elephant population is only a few hundred animals, so really it's nothing in the grand scheme of things. And it did inspire a lot of self-reflection and change in the zoo community. There was some real welfare improvements around the world, some of it inspired by a subsequent very large grant-funded study of North American elephants, which I'll talk about in a minute. And in 2019, this work even helped encourage CITES to impose a near total ban on sending wild African elephants to zoos, which I do feel was the right thing until zoos can demonstrably solve or identify whatever it is causes these premature deaths. So what I can say from all of this is that there really are a lot of pros to this kind of approach. Personally, it can be a hell of a lot of fun. It helps reveal and probe public interest and concern, which can be useful. It can reach audiences in places with little or no animal welfare policy. So, for example, our elephant work, we reached India and China, for example. And it can even help change public interests and concerns and even help change policy. But it does have a number of disadvantages. So one is that public interest can be rather strange and arbitrary. Elephants are sexy, so get lots of attention. I think if I'd published the same on rats or something small and unattractive, it wouldn't have attracted the same attention. It can generate huge resentment in the industry being criticized, which can backfire in various ways. Also, it means that just one paper by just one lab can have a huge sway, and I do wonder if that's right. As John Ioannidis has so convincingly argued, most published research findings are actually false, and we know from biomedical research that more than half of studies can't be replicated. So it makes me a little uneasy when one paper has enormous impact. It's also not really right that high impact journals attract so much media attention, because it's high impact journals that have the highest retraction rates, which is kind of ironic. And I would also say from an EDI front that this rather rewards researchers with large egos and a lot of chutzpah over more modest researchers or those who view science as a more collective enterprise. So if you don't have the personality or the research environment to kind of hustle for a high impact journal, do media interviews and what have you, you'll get less attention. And I don't really think that's fair. I should admit that I'm skewed here towards the traditional media because I'm old. But I think things also risk being a bit inequitable on social media too. There's a lot of potential for good, worthwhile impact here. But of course, if you're out there on social media, which I'm not, even when things get nasty, we know which gender has to be braver to stay on because of trolls. So that's a con. Okay, so a second route to change is working with industry such that animal welfare research feeds directly to animal users. And this may be because the work is co-generated, co-designed by them and perhaps funded by them. So this is me with some really great mink farmers, and we ran 2 collaborative projects to develop practical, effective enrichments for on-farm use and also to study the impacts of cage size. And here I am working with AZA, American Association of Zoos and Aquaria Zoos, to investigate how husbandry variation impacts elephant welfare in this very large project led by Janine Brown, Kathy Karlstead, and others. My role was much more peripheral here, but it was cool to be invited. And the pros of this approach are, again, it can be very fun, but in a different way. It's extremely satisfying to work with people on the front line of animal use. And it also gives you different perspectives. It kicks you out of your academic bubble and makes you see what it's really like to be someone who's actually working in these industries. Furthermore, that it can be really impactful because it can be well and appropriately disseminated in a trusted way and therefore be widely adopted because it's being passed on by what Dan Weary and colleagues have called the gatekeepers of an animal industry. So as a couple of examples, in my own work, we found that mink given a wire mesh shelf or bunk would use these, particularly if they were mothers with babies, because it allowed them to get away from their demanding offspring. We also show that mink avidly used even quite simple enrichments, and as a consequence, in Denmark and Canada, both of these cage modifications have been made mandatory, which has improved well-being for tens of millions of mink. So this is amongst my proudest achievements, and it was done by working with industry. Of course, this approach has disadvantages too. So working with industry can be challenging because they're not necessarily scientifically literate. I mean, why should they be? And so they may push for weird experimental designs, things with confounds. Let's put all the enrichments in one shed and all the non-enriched cages in another shed. Clearly a bad experimental design. If you're working closely with industry, you may find that for change there to actually stick may take sustained work and an understanding of the psychology of behavioral change, which may be beyond the capacity of your own job as an academic and be beyond your own expertise. It's inevitably going to be limited to incremental, modest changes. So the mink industry is never going to fund work into giant cages or swimming water because that's going to put farmers out of business. And in the case of the Zoo Elephant Project, they deliberately chose not to look at mortality rates because they knew this would close doors, that people just wouldn't get involved. And they also deliberately chose not to store or share any of the data collected for the same reasons, even though someone then could have used those data to test ideas about the biological causes of premature death. So I think this was the right thing to do, sort of politically and logistically. It allowed the project to happen, but clearly it's also a crying shame and illustrates the sort of limitations that can occur with this type of approach. Work funded by industry also tends to slightly undersell the value of proposed changes as well. And I'd really recommend a lovely paper by Agnes van der Schot and Clive Phillips, who analyze what papers say when they're funded by different funding sources. It's a really nice study. Okay, so the third approach is that our research accrues into a corpus of literature that then is used, hopefully it develops some kind of consensus, and this is used by working groups and committees who then synthesize the evidence and make recommendations. So as I mentioned, I've sat on 27 of these things. My work is also cited by over 50 policy documents around the world. It's been used by the European Union and 12 countries, governmental agencies, and that's true for many of us. So this has a lot of advantages. I think this is probably the best approach, though ironically, I'm going to list a hell of a lot of cons, but the pros include that it uses a corpus of evidence. So typically, recommendations are building on well-replicated findings, not just a single paper, which I think is really important. The committees are usually scientifically literate, and so some informal peer review, some informal judgment of quality can happen during this process. In terms of impact, the committees aren't usually ad hoc. They're typically some kind of standing committee that has some kind of status and is feeding into an existing policy-making process, which more or less ensures that change will happen. So all of these are great. They're really important. Still, even this approach has a lot of disadvantages. So one disadvantage that's both a pro and a con actually is that it can be a very slow way for research to have an impact. So I'm finding some of my own work from the 1990s is only just now having an impact on policy, but in a way that's good. It's because it's been subsequently replicated and supported by other studies. And I think in a sense, if things are slow because they're waiting for replication, that's not bad. But even once recommendations are made, it can have very slow impacts on animal industries if the sticks and carrots behind the recommendations or requirements aren't correct. So to give a couple of examples from Canada, here the National Farm Animal Care Council makes code of practice for farmed animal species. And for pigs and farmed mink, The codes recently required pig farmers and pig farmers to group house sows and mink farmers to use bigger cages, and the codes allowed a 10-year lead time. But in both cases, 10 years later, 50% of the farmers hadn't made the required changes, and so then they were granted another 5 years grace, which is very frustrating for people who want to see change. But the issue was paying for these big infrastructure changes themselves, learning the new skills requiring to manage a new system, and perhaps also being reluctant to change and downright resentful. All of this caused immense slowness. What might surprise you as well is that I find that often these committees are surprisingly subjective and non-transparent, both in terms of their processes and in terms of their outputs. So here's one example of what I mean. The choice of focus can be swayed by what's seen as feasible or by what's seen as wanted by the public, independent of its true importance in terms of animal suffering. So a specific example here again comes from mink. So in the 2013 mink codes, farmers were required to give animals taller cages. Some farmers had cages that were 30 centimeters high, and those were required to be at least something like 45 centimeters high. This was based on what was regarded as acceptable to the public. There was no research on this at all, and recognizing there was no research, they then funded research, which I and my colleagues did, and I think the hope was it would support the recommendation. But instead, 4 years later, we found mink really don't care how tall their cage is. They care about other things. They care about how big the footprint of the cage is and what the cage contains. But cage height, they really don't care about. And so farmers that made this change spent a lot of money doing something that could have been spent in much better ways in terms of animal welfare. Another way in which these committees can be surprisingly subjective and non-transparent is that they're always based on narrative literature reviews. And narrative literature reviews, as the very name conveys, are often telling a bit of a story. How literature is gleaned and put together is not transparent, it's a little bit arbitrary. And so what's included in the literature reviews, again, can be swayed by what's seen as feasible or wanted by the public, but also by members' own knowledge and their implicit or explicit biases, and perhaps even self-promotion. So you can imagine that all of us have friends whose work we like because we like the people. We've seen people give great talks at conferences, and so we remember those and we're likely to pass those on. And this is worrying because if you've got a disability and you don't make it to many conferences, your work may go under the radar. There's also quite a lot of evidence from other fields that men's work is cited more than women's work. And I'd be curious to know if men's work feeds more into these literature reviews than women's work. In a similar vein, there's also a lot of scope for strong-willed individuals to make a big difference on these committees. So the chair can play an important role. And I've said chairman here because, at least for me, for 21 of my 27 committees, that's 78%, the chairs were men. And this matters not just from an EDI perspective, because we're in a female-dominated field, so why are the chairs men? But also lots of evidence shows that, at least on average, people who identify as male care less about animals and animal welfare than people who identify as female. Furthermore, people who are confident or even self-promoting may have disproportionate sway compared to people who are more self-effacing. So this is worrying from an EDI perspective. So all these three methods are non-ideal, but I do think they're important, they're valuable, we should keep up with all of them, but I think they can be better. So I want to talk about three reasons I have for optimism that make me feel cheerful that all these processes will work in a more impactful and equitable way in the future. So these are, as I mentioned, by learning from the effective altruism movement, by learning from how policy is made in medicine, which also is good for EDI. And I'm so happy we can talk about EDI now, because when I started out in the 80s and 90s, to ask whether a process worked for or included women, for example, would have triggered eye rolling, if you can imagine that. And we can also learn from biomedicine and the well-documented challenges faced by research coming out of that field. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with effective altruism by now. Here are a number of groups which discuss effective altruism in the context of animal welfare. And during this conference, you've also heard from the Wild Animal Initiative, a group inspired by effective altruism principles and funded by open philanthropy, because the number of free-living wild animals who can potentially suffer is so mind-blowingly staggering. In effective altruism, argues that if we want to do the most good, we should take a very rational and quantitative approach to effecting change. And in the context of animal welfare, we should be considering three things, one of which is the importance of a welfare problem. And by importance, effective altruists mean how many animals are affected, how severely are they affected, and for how long does their suffering continues. And they strive to come up with integrative measures of total suffering or net negative effect, if we're factoring in positive experiences as well, so that you can objectively weigh up where should we focus our efforts and where should we look to make change. In addition, effective altruists think about tractability. Is there a workable solution? And if not, how could there be? And they also think about neglectedness, particularly in the context of research. So are there overlooked topics that really should be funded and worked on for the sake of animals? So I think looking at our own field through an effective altruism lens can be interesting, particularly if we think about importance and neglectedness. And so we already know that some species and some topics are rather neglected by research, even though they're really important from a welfare perspective. So some were flagged by me, Mike Walker, and Maria Diaz-Leon 10 years ago in this paper. Now, this paper's a little dated. We didn't even think about free-living wildlife, didn't even occur to us. We didn't even think about insects. It definitely needs redoing. But we did flag a disturbing lack of work on fish, on farmed fish, even though the number of animals affected is just unbelievable in quantity, but they only attract a tiny fraction of animal welfare research. Looking at pets, this is just a topic close to my own heart. Pets are the second largest animal sector after farmed animals, but pets are rather little studied despite their huge populations. And within pets, dogs get around twice as much research as cats, even though cats outnumber dogs. And I did a quick check to check that's still true, and that's remained true in the last 10 years. So we need to work on cats and farmed fish. It also flags that I also think we should think more about supporting and collaborating with our colleagues in the developing world who are working on intensive agriculture there. We should work on insect and shrimp farming now in case they're sentient, and I would acknowledge Megan Barrett for her excellent arguments here. We need to do more work on free-living wild animals. I would like to flag a topic close to my own heart, which is the terrible plight of free-living rats and mice, who are often controlled as pets in really, really barbaric ways. They're often killed in the billions in ways that are extremely cruel. And this issue continues today. I'd recommend this great paper by Sandra Baker and her colleagues. There's not much work on the welfare implications of pest control, and there really should be. Other research gaps in our science suggested by an effective altruism perspective and thinking about suffering, neglectedness, and also improving the tractability of problems. I think this approach also suggests that we need more research in techniques for measuring the duration of suffering and the impact of prolonged suffering, including biological and behavioral indicators of cumulative effective experience. Telomere length might be a candidate, hippocampal volume might be a candidate, judgment bias might be, and I think also some forms of stereotypic behavior. I think this is really important if we want to start quantifying net duration of misery. We also need more meta research examining what we're doing and what we're missing. Me sort of giving you my sort of personal take is not enough. I think we need to be more quantitative here. And thinking about tractability, although of course there is some social science research in our field, I think it would be nice to think about how our research can help persuade people to care, especially for the disparaged species, for animals that are often written off as cold in temperament, ugly, dumb. They just don't attract public compassion. I think research into these animals' empathy and intelligence would be really fun to do and potentially impactful for animal welfare, albeit in an indirect way. And just to be idealistic for a moment, wouldn't it be wonderful if lessons from effective altruism informed animal welfare policy as well, so that animal welfare policy starts being influenced by what's most important for the maximum number of suffering animals, instead of being sidetracked by the perceived unusualness or low benefits of particular practices. Okay, my other sort of source of optimism is the way in which people in the medical world have formalized the use of evidence in the development of policy guidelines. And I think we can learn from this, and we can also learn from our veterinary colleagues who are more savvy about this than I think we are if we have a more ethological background. So GRADE stands for the grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. And it is a way to formalize how evidence is collated so that literature reviews are systematic, not narrative, so that every good study counts and counts equally, no matter what university it comes from, no matter who the PI is. Incorporation is critical, so study quality is analyzed, and the amount and strength of evidence is analyzed, perhaps using meta-analytic approaches, whereby lots of studies with cumulative large effect sizes have a big impact, and small or isolated studies are treated with caution, even if they're done by someone persuasive and charismatic from a good university. So I'd recommend this nice paper by Simon Moore from UC Dublin for a quick overview of how veterinarians are advancing the way in which we use evidence in policy development. And I also want to say a big thank you to Dr. Jess Kate, who's a postdoc in my lab, and my colleague Mark Avey at the CCAC. It's really they that have opened my eyes to the value of applying a GRADE approach to animal welfare policy. And I'm not going to say any more because I think they said it beautifully in their talk yesterday. Okay, the final lessons I think we can learn that would be useful for being more impactful are those inspired by the research problems that are now very well understood in medical research, in biomedical research, and in psychology too. And these are the common problems seen with the internal validity, external validity, and construct validity of research. And we haven't done that much self-reflection in the world of animal welfare, and I think we should, because it's better that we do it to ourselves than someone else does it to us. So biomedical research, as I already mentioned, has been revealed as having a very poor replication rate. So this means if a study is repeated, there's under a 50% chance that the same result will be found again. And this wastes animals, it wastes time, it wastes money. It means if you're in this field, you know, maybe half of what you're reading, you shouldn't really believe. You're constantly chasing ephemeral sort of will-o'-the-wisps. Does this problem apply to animal welfare research? I'm going to bet yes, but nobody's looked as yet. And this isn't the only problem that biomedical research has been revealed as having. Even when biomedical animal-based research is replicable, it then has very low practical usefulness to human medicine. This is known as translatability. So even looking at replicable research, only around 10% of therapies that look promising in animals successfully translate to animals. And this again costs a staggering amount of money. And the equivalent for us would be, for example, something being a welfare problem in our research lab, but not on a farm, or something being a welfare problem on a farm, but we don't see it when we study animals in our own research laboratories at a university. So these problems in biomedical research really are, to me, trigger the question when it comes to doing science, are we doing any better than our biomedical colleagues, and what can we learn from them? And I think this is relevant because as academic researchers, we're governed by the same incentive structures, which are basically to publish, publish, publish. And as Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, wrote in 2015, at least in the biomedical world, and I think for us as well, no one is incentivized to be right. Instead, we're incentivized to be productive, which is obviously not the same thing. So I'm going to talk about some ways in which I think we could do better. I need to say that please don't treat this as me being preachy. When I say we need to do better, I'm including myself in this because I'm going to list some practices that I try and adopt, but I don't always. So my recommendations are in the same vein as me saying we all need to exercise more and drink more water. You know I'm right. You also know I don't always meet my own ideals, but saying this out loud will help me stick to my guns. Okay, so there's many, many contributing factors to the hot mess that biomedical research has been revealed as being. And I list some papers here. I list some in the BMC paper I opened with, and I'm going to give you some more useful papers here. But the contributing factors include that there are publication biases across the corpus of literature, in particular, the obvious bias that significant results get published and non-significant findings don't get published so that they're invisible. Now, in animal welfare science, we could estimate the magnitude of this problem with relevant file draw tests and funnel plot graphs, and yet we don't do that yet. We could also reduce this problem, if it is a problem, by greater use of registered reports that allow us to publish non-significant findings, which is a kind of lovely idea all round. Another problem is that there are publication biases within the published papers that actually come out. And these include low external validity, whereby the content of a study is fine and relevant to the animals in that study, but they don't generalize to different species or even different breeds or strains or different ages or sexes or tests or housing conditions. So Marion Dawkins has written beautifully on this problem. And again, I'd like to flag this paper by Simon Moore because he basically argues that a lot of animal welfare research is not remotely done to be useful. And I think that's true. My own research is often done to be interesting and provocative more than practically useful. And that's kind of frustrating from an external validity and usefulness perspective. Another validity problem is low construct validity, where the signs or indicators we're using don't mean what we think they mean. So in our case, it would mean we're claiming that something indicates good or poor welfare when actually it doesn't. So this is obviously problematic because then we're going to draw mistaken conclusions about animal well-being. It's also problematic for our own credibility, actually. So some examples are when we treat corticosteroids as stress hormones, when of course we all know that they reflect activity or arousal. When we use animal play as a sign of happiness, when there's very little evidence of that, plus play is heterogeneous. When we use unvalidated judgment bias tasks as signs of pessimism or optimism, when they're simply not doing that. Claiming that stereotypic behavior is a coping response when it suits our story, and all examples of harking, which means hypothesizing after the results are known. In other words, when we retrofit meaning onto our indicators once we've seen our results in order to tell a story. And obviously this is circular reasoning. So I think we need to be very worried about construct validity in our work. And I would recommend this paper because they're so incredibly rude about our field in a way that I think is incredibly useful and should provoke some self-reflection. In terms of doing better construct validity, I suggested a few papers in the BMC paper that I opened with, but I'd also like to flag some work done with and by my good friend and colleague Mike Mendel. So Mike and I wrote a paper in 1993 about construct validation that I think still applies today. And Mike and his colleagues at Bristol have also written a lovely paper in 2022 on construct validation that I'd recommend here. And then the two of us, along with Beat and Nielsen from U4, are currently editing and co-writing a book on construct validation. And if this book doesn't kill us first, it will emerge sometime in 2025. And I think it's going to be really useful. We cover indicators of emotion, indicators of mood, and indicators of cumulative affective experience. And I want to thank all the authors involved in this. The final validity problem is low internal validity, and this is perhaps the most worrying because it means the patterns we see are not only misinterpreted, but they're actually not real at all. They're completely bogus. And causes of low internal validity include experimental biases, introduced by practices like not randomizing your subjects, not using blinding so that you bias your own results, and mysterious exclusion criteria where you drop outliers in order to create a good story. And statistical biases introduced by p-hacking, where you run analysis after analysis in the hope of finding something. Researcher degrees of freedom, where you do creative things with your models or your transformations in order to find something. Pseudo-replication, where observations or individuals in groups are treated as units of replication when that's not the right level. And also low power studies, which are prone to generating both false positive results and also crazily strong effects, because only a strong effect would be published with an underpower study, and often these are really unrealistic. So again, my BMC paper recommends some good papers to read on this. I also just stumbled across this very nice paper by a Dutch colleague that I'd really recommend highly. And Hanno Verbel has covered everything beautifully in a seminar he gave to the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare, and it's on our YouTube site, so I'd really, really recommend it. Okay, so to wrap up, this is what I tried to do today. I tried to give you an overview of 3 main ways in which animal welfare science can change policy and practice and their pros and cons. And I tried to show you 3 main ways in which I think we can all do better in the future, helped and inspired by colleagues from other fields. Did I pull this off? I can't tell because I can only see Matt's face. I can't see anyone else. So I would love to know if you have questions or comments. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Georgia. Lucky you only getting to see my face, eh? That's not been staring at me throughout the entire talk as I turn around and take photos of my cat on the bed and so on. Okay, so there are a few. So the chat function on this is almost impossible to navigate. So I'm going to try and because people answer other questions and then they jump up. Okay, so starting off, there were a few questions about. I think people were confused, thinking that you were a massive fan of mink farming, which I'm not going to put to you because I think that's probably a slight misrepresentation of what you're saying, so I'm not going to go into that. There was an interesting one actually that came up about humane killing methods. I think obviously, you know, as you said, you know, I think often people have a sort of underlying idea that there is no such thing as a humane killing method, but I think it would probably be maybe useful to explain, you know, some of the evidence around that, because there were a couple of points and questions about why, for example, carbon monoxide would be a humane killing method. So I don't know if you could touch on that.
Yeah, carbon monoxide is, well, it's a humane killing method for animals that can't detect anoxia because you just don't know it's happening to you. It's why people use it in suicide attempts, for example. It doesn't cause distress because you just become unconscious before you know it. So obviously that's terrible for people who love you. And if you take a different view of the value of life, that you think your interests have been curtailed by the loss of a life, then it is a welfare problem. If I'm focused on suffering, killing without suffering then isn't a welfare problem. In the context of mink, you would expect them to detect hypoxia. So my hunch going in would have been this wouldn't be a good killing method for mink, but actually they seem to inhale it so quickly that it acts so fast, they're just unconscious almost immediately. It's absolutely incredible. So if I was an intensively kept animal, be it on a farm or in a laboratory, I would want to be a mink, particularly in terms of killing methods. So it's not that I'm a massive fan of mink farming, it's just that I have a massive dislike of all intensive animal use, and mink farming is just not the worst. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. I actually had a question. I don't think I've ever asked you this before, actually, but in terms of the preference testing stuff. So when you're, because you said about how some of the environments were seen as positive, and I understand that. I'm interested to know what you think the baseline is. So do you think of it as a continuum from zero, where zero is the ultimate horribleness, and 100 is the ultimate wonderfulness, like hell versus heaven, or do you see zero as being the center point, and anything below zero being being okay to horribleness, and anything above zero being okay to wonderfulness? How do you differentiate between those? Is it two different processes that compete? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. So in the context of preference experiments, all we can ever say, I think, is that the preferred environment gives relatively better welfare because it's giving the animal what they want. We can't tell from a simple preference test whether we're shunting an animal from absolute misery to slightly less misery, or whether we're taking the animal from neutral to paradise. And so, think of all the loaded language about enriched environments that really implies that a standard quote cage is neutral and an enriched environment is nice, when in reality, probably the animal is going from a terrible environment to a less terrible environment. Preference experiments on their own can't tell you where you are on that valence axis. Absolutely. They can only tell you where you are relatively. In terms of distinguishing absolute positive from relative positive, I think that's really an interesting and challenging question. I think we can do it from things like expressions and signals. I think we could possibly do it with some neurobiological based approaches, because I do think the underlying mechanisms are different. But I think welfare research has not done a good job here. And that most of the stuff I see on positive welfare is just talking about relatively positive welfare and arguing that it's absolutely positive without any good evidence.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? Does that answer your
Yeah, no, it
question?
does. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so delving into a few of these. So why aren't more people examining poor quality animal welfare research compared to, for example, biomed, neuroscience, and so on? Obviously, we need higher quality animal welfare research. So do you have any sort of gauge as to why that might be?
I mean, I just think, realizations are slow. Movements in science are slow. It began in, I mean, the concerns around replication began in human psychology and sort of spread to adjacent disciplines from there. So sort of biological psychology and then biomedical research were kind of obviously next in the chain. Ecological research is now starting to examine its own ability to replicate experiments. Fundamental animal behavior is starting to ask questions about whether its subjects are weird, which are essentially questions about external validity. Animal welfare science isn't there yet. I think we're just a small discipline that often follows other disciplines. We're often applying other people's knowledge and then applying it to animal welfare problems. And I think this is a case in point. I don't think it shows that we're terrible. It just shows that we just need to get on and do it.
Do you think it's maybe because we ask the wrong questions sometimes as well? I kind of got the impression that.
Well, maybe it's a bit, I feel a bit sometimes that everyone's going to hate me at this point, but I think sometimes we feel if it might affect change that might help animals, it doesn't matter if our research isn't very good. Actually, I do. And there's a tiny bit of me that's got sympathy because I do really dislike most animal use. But then I think that's a misuse of science. I think pseudo replication matters, even if it then generates a result that really pushes for genuine animal welfare benefit. I still think pseudo replication matters because I love science and I don't want science to be criticized. And actually, I don't want problematic science to be used as a stick to beat us with later. farmers are up in arms in Europe, aren't they, about the things they're being asked to do environmentally and in terms of welfare. And if any of them get wind that some of the research is maybe suboptimal, if that proves to be the case, then all of us get smeared with that. So I think we just need to critically examine our own house. I think it would be easy and fun, actually. You know, those of you who might do this, meta research doesn't cost much money, which is one of the wonderful things about it. If you're an early career researcher starting out, this could be like on trend and doesn't require a whopping great grant. Yeah.
Yep. Excellent. Okay, so I've got one from Roz Clubb, who you may or may not know.
Hello, Ross.
So excellent talk, Georgia. Okay, do you have any recommendations about how to educate policymakers about giving greater weighting to robust science, and would the grade system do this?
I've got to admit, I don't know enough about the grade system to know whether it can be readily handed over. I think it probably could, but I'd need to look into that more. And honestly, I think you'd need to talk to Jess Kate, who's really knows her stuff here. And policymakers would include, obviously, committees often involve scientists. And I think we all need to get a bit more, you know, when we're refereeing papers, a bit more literate in terms of asking for blinding, checking that randomization happened, looking at the statistics. You know, I'm going to say most of the papers I get asked to referee are terrible. Terrible. My group has come to hate refereeing papers because they're almost always bad. And a lot of terrible stuff gets published. Why is that happening? What are the editors doing? What are the referees doing? Sorry, I was turned into a bit of a rant, Roz. Sorry.
Do you think improving? I mean, I suppose this is probably a rhetorical question and stupid considering what you just been saying. But do you think if the quality of research did improve, that would essentially make a difference to what Roz is saying, that it would help us to get the point across better to policymakers? I mean, to what extent, what extent of the variance, if you like, do you think that accounts for?
I don't think it would at the moment, but it would help protect us from criticism and pushback later, actually. I mean, what makes a difference to policymakers? Often it's, well, seeing a very persuasive bulletproof animal welfare argument, actually. Seeing costs in dollars, seeing the public PR impacts, even though obviously that's annoyingly arbitrary. And sometimes I think also we could all perhaps be better educated in theories of behavioral change. So if you haven't come across, they used to be called human behavioral change for animals, and I think the organization is now called human behavioral change for something much bigger. Does anyone know? Matt, do you know what I'm talking about? Human behavioral change for life. They're an organization that have some great training modules in just how you can persuade people to change. And it's some of it's drawn from addiction research, some of it's drawn from sort of organizational psychology. It's really interesting, and it illustrates how a kind of top-down preaching approach, don't do this, it's bad, doesn't really work, doesn't really stick, doesn't really deal with the obstacles that are in the way of change. So I think it's that, they have some really great resources that have really changed how I see how we should be turning our work into policy as well. That would be a whole other talk.
Thanks. Yeah, somebody's just put a link to that in the chat.
Great.
So
Thank you. They're just a great organization, and their little courses, you have to pay something like £20 or something, but they're really well worth it.
Excellent. Okay, so there's one more question, and then we'll call it a day. So where are we? I've lost it now. Oh, there it is. So do you think the free roaming farms similar to those that you see in rehab and let animals live? Right, sorry, I'll start again. Do you think the free roaming farms similar to those you see in rehabilitation centres let animals live as close to the wild as possible? Do you think this is, is this less bad, I guess, than what you might see in other situations?
Well, probably, and I think behavioral restriction is a massive problem. I think losing the mother too early is a problem, not being able to move, not being able to escape from conspecifics, not being able to do highly motivated natural behaviors. I think these are massive problems that contribute to stereotypic behavior, depression-like changes, immunosuppression, animals dying early, that kind of thing. Free-ranging situations, I think, have got much more scope to be better. They require careful management because animals can still fight with each other and what have you. You need to be really on top of disease and that kind of thing. So they're not instant panaceas, but they've got a lot more scope for much greater animal welfare. Yes. Yes is
Wonderful.
the short answer.
Yes, absolutely. Good, brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Georgia, and thanks everybody for the questions. So that now brings us seamlessly to the end of the workshop. So just very, very briefly before we finish, thank you ever so much for everybody coming over the last 2 days. I think it's been a fantastic workshop. Also, thanks very much to our sponsors. So the City University in Hong Kong, Jockey Club, College of Veterinary Medicine and Life Sciences, also the City University in Hong Kong Centre for Animal Health and Welfare, and to the University of Surrey Biosciences School that funded this workshop. As we've mentioned a few times, the talks will be made available on YouTube in due course, and the links will be put onto the website. So yeah, thanks very much, everybody, and it's been great, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the future.